Great. Thanks so much, Matt. You've raised almost every point that I'm going to kind of counter or put in contrast with the digital or digitized collections. I will go back to my slides because I just want to kind of put questions for our thought as we go through it. And I want to frame our conversation in terms of Caribbean studies and specifically and disaster studies as well in terms of digital technology and how digital technology has helped us, to do, yeah. So I've written an essay recently for a publication called The Digital Black Atlantic, which is an edited collection on digital humanities studies across the Black Atlantic. And in that essay, called Heterotopias of Resistance, I think about digital technology as the heterotopia of our time. Heterotopia is a term coming out of Michel Foucault's thinking about how space is organized historically, and thinking about how he thinks about the idea of a ship as existing in a space where both time and space are kind of collapsed and boundaries around nationalism are also flattened in a certain way and allows for people to exist and produce the production of knowledge and history to be produced in these sort of simultaneous and symbiotic ways, right? So digital technology is the heterotopia of our time. It is the space in which we can, what I call, participate in that, a term I have amended from Homi Bhabha called simultaneous nationality. We can participate in national time. We can be with our people wherever we are across space. And digital technology has also allowed us to extend the possibilities of how we curate and preserve our historical record. And I think thinking about the way technology and the digital have provided these possibilities for us makes it seem that everything is accessible and everyone can be accessible in some way, shape, or form. And that is sort of something we want to contend with today. It has, in good ways, created access to local knowledges and extended the reach of knowledge produced by and about us. And it has allowed, as in the case of Digital Library of the Caribbean, to what I call repatriate local knowledges and Caribbean history. Matt made the point about gatekeeping, where both nefarious and well-meaning entities have preserved material in archives and libraries and museums all over the world in the global north about our histories in the global south. Of course, that is all of these activities, whether they are well-meaning or nefarious, are products of colonial violence, right? The fact that, and they are products of empire. So the origin story of our disseminated histories in this way, both from a point of view of where our artifacts, our objects, our texts are stored, as well as our bodies. So migration is a product of colonial violence, right? The fact that we have this thing called the African diaspora is itself part of that colonial project. And so how do we think about repatriating stories, repatriating local knowledges and Caribbean history through digital technology? It allows us to be able to move closer to our texts and move closer to our objects, but it also does other things where we now, because we know more, because we can quote unquote see more, we have this idea to use that ownership and power to reframe how it is we think about our right to our relationship with our histories in the future, right? So I want to set up on that front to talk about the critical way in which digital technology has shifted our relationship to this historical material from the point of view of curation and to the point of interpretation, analysis, dissemination, storytelling. And so we think about gatekeeping. I think about gatekeeping from two valences, as Matt and I had discussed it. One is about access and ownership, right? And one is about where are the things, right? I lived for a very long time. I went to school and worked in the United States, and as a Caribbeanist, as a post-colonial scholar. And most of the time, I was able to see a lot of things that I didn't know growing up in the Caribbean. As someone who lived and went to school and grew up in the Caribbean, I didn't know those things existed, and I found them in the libraries of the New York Public Library, NYU, the Library of Congress, and things like that. And this is while I sort of knew, I guess, theoretically or intellectually that this had happened, being able to go to these spaces and do research there about things that were never accessible to me as a student in my own home were really moments of not only intellectual challenge, but also personal challenge in terms of framing who I thought myself to be or what I understood about the place I came from. And that is with or without our understanding of disaster. And I'm going to stop in a while to tell you some personal stories that are framed around this idea. I think about archivists as custodians of history, right? If we want to think about the well-meaning archivist or the person who is doing good work in the archive as finding, preserving, the act of receiving the object, preserving the object, cataloging the object, making it accessible, available, and preserving it long-term, making it sustainable. The work of archivists is to be a custodian of history, to give it longevity, to make sure that it is generative and it creates continuity for generations, right? It's about this legacy. But we also have to think about archivists and historians as storytellers, right? What happens to an object in the archive? Someone takes it, any archive, physical, digital, and they are to interpret, analyze it. And if we have good historians, anthropologists, cultural workers, literary scholars, cultural scholars, they're putting that against other types of information, other types of stories. So we have field work, like Matt was saying, you go to the archive and you will see the colonial record. I will give an example from a traumatic moment in Dominica's history is the 1814 Maroon War. There's a series of letters in our archive that talk about one of the most evil men in the history of the empire, called Governor Ainsley, who is the governor in Dominica for the period, and writes these colonial letters back and forth to the crown, and documenting all of the ways in which the Maroons are evil and causing harm and creating this disturbance, and he wants to restore order. Now, historically, a lot of archivists, anthropologists, and historians have really done a good job in reframing this story, because we now know Governor Ainsley is one of the most evil men that existed in the empire, right? There's a history of what, if you study Caribbean studies, he's a figure, almost like a caricature of himself. But Governor Ainsley's letters, on the surface, I had my students interact with them for the first time, and they're seeing this, and it's sort of a traumatic experience for them to read about Dominica from the point of view of this man, without having any context about why he was writing these letters or not. And so the story to be shared can be in the actual material in the archive, but there's also the work that the storytellers are doing. And I think about storytelling as I'm a literary scholar by training, so I'm always thinking about storytelling, but I think all of our various disciplines are about framing the story, right? About giving a shape and giving an architecture, a framework to whatever exists in the archiving, so that it can be meaningful to the people who need those stories the most. The question we're asking today in terms of disaster is, who needs those stories? Are the stories worth telling, or are they, when I say worth telling, I mean, is it productive and efficient to tell those stories without causing further harm than the disasters themselves, right? And then who gets to decide what has value? There's a really good essay by Kevin Brown, and I put it in the reference list, and we will share the PowerPoint, so you'll get the link to that, where he takes material that was going to be discarded by the National Archives from Trinidad and Tobago, because they were too old and they were falling apart. And so they were preparing to throw them away, right? And so he went into the archive and took all this discarded material, because they no longer were quality enough to be able to be preserved and displayed in the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago and photograph them in a way to create an additional layer of preservation of material that was considered too old, too damaged to be preserved, right? So we have these different levels about how do we find value in discarded things, right? And I think a lot about how Derrida thinks of an archive as both residence and consignment. It gives something a shape, but it's also the place in which it is stored, right? It gives it a home, and it's also the place where value is assigned to it, right? So if we're thinking about this in terms of the digital collections, we want to think about how digitizing things, both the things that the quote unquote have value and the things that are discarded end up being part of the practice. And this is where we get to the idea of mediation, right? How does this mediation that happens in the National Archives when they decide something is to throw away, right? Or something is worth preserving, or something needs to be put in an exhibition. How do these decisions get made differently or in the same ways in the context of the digital, right? How does dLOC, for example, decide what topical collections get told or put together in certain ways, and how do we interact with that? I just want to reinforce that today's presentations are really about getting people to think about, this presentation is really about getting you to think about what kinds of questions and things you should be thinking about when you do your work. So you will see a lot of questions and not me saying, here's how to go into be an ethical person in the archive. I don't know what that means in everyone's case. Everyone is different, right? So I want to go to this section of encounter to tell stories, but also to ask some questions that some of you might have seen before because you were at the different, you were at the Dreaming with Data session. And I think those questions are ethical questions to always ask of any text, no matter what type of work you're doing, right? And which is why I keep bringing them back. Before you interact with an object, a cultural object, a text, an artifact, you need to know that it existed before you knew it existed, right? I know archivists and librarians are always on the internet yelling at people to stop saying they discovered something in the archive. You did not discover a thing in the archive. I am from Dominica. Dominica, for those of you who don't know, is a small island in the center of the Eastern Caribbean. And I take great umbrage at Dominica's tourism product as a project of colonial violence. Now, I do not make the rules for the government. I recognize that, sadly. However, Dominica, for the last, I want to say 15 or 20 years, has branded itself in its ecotourism nature island of the Caribbean project, which is working or something. The branding of our tourism authority says, discover Dominica. That's the whole story. Now, I think about the idea of discovery as a post-colonial scholar. This is, of course, upsetting to me daily. And I have made attempts to draw people's attention to the fact, people in authority, the attention to the fact that this might not be doing what you think it's doing. However, it rhymes. And Dominica has sort of a mythical story, which is not, I don't know if it's in our best interest. I'm probably not supposed to tell this story. There's Dominicans on the call, they can laugh if this is telling our business. But we have this story where they say Dominica is the only island that Christopher Columbus will find again if he comes back. And that's because of its terrain and its relative, to those who are being critical of any government in power, to its relative underdevelopment compared to the other islands, right? When we say underdevelopment, it's in the context of modernity, right? It doesn't have all the skyways and the buildings and the people as other islands. And so because of this relative underdevelopment to other countries, and because it's so rugged and so green, now the real story is that Christopher Columbus actually never did anything to Dominica. He never even stopped there, but which is really the funniest part of the story, right? He never even got off the boat. So there's that part. Now I'm also a survivor of natural disasters in Dominica. Since I've lived in Dominica in 2013, there's been several torrential downpours, in addition to Tropical Storm Erica in 2015, which caused approximately 35 people to go missing or presumed dead in a major landslide in one part of the country. And in 2017, we suffered the Category 5 Hurricane Maria 3 days before Puerto Rico, and suffered damage to about 90 to 95% of our of the country was completely destroyed. Now, I am a scholar of Caribbean studies, doing work in Caribbean studies, and working with students to repair and repatriate history before these natural disasters that I have just referenced, right? And a part of our project was to help them learn the process of preserving history. So in Create Caribbean, they would go into the archive, they would look at the Governor Ainsley letters. I had them not only interact with the letters in the text, they were responsible for digitizing the collection. They digitized it, and then they transcribed the letters to make them more accessible. So I had been working with students to build ethical relationships with archives, from taking them from physical to digitized versions, in order to help them think about those broader questions of what was happening and to understand their history better. Now comes the hurricanes, and things change a little bit, right? And I wrote about this, I referenced it in the letters, about one day my landlord, who is very proud of me, I want to get out of this screen for a second so I could talk about it. He brings a French journalist to Dominica to stay at in our other apartment. So because he lives in Guadeloupe, to cover the hurricane in the days following Hurricane Maria. And he tells them I'm this really great professor and he's so proud of me, and I am the person they need to talk to about all of the things that are happening. Now, in the days following Hurricane Maria, I have some internet access compared to other people. And I am getting a lot of requests on my Twitter account from the Weather Service, ABC. They want a comment on what happened in the storm. They want to know if people are dead. They want, so a lot of us who had generally public profiles were getting requests to talk to media in the immediate moment after the hurricane about where people were and so on. And so then I did or didn't respond to some of those requests, and those things happen. It wasn't until the journalists came to Dominica, and we were, I was being just gracious, having a conversation with them. And one night they asked me to talk to them about the part that Matt referenced, right? Tell us about what happened before. How was Dominica doing leading up to this moment? And what do you think these conversations are going to be after? Now, this is a really strange moment that's happening because these are French journalists. I speak the language to, I would say, beginner to moderate fluency when I am not in a French country. And so there are all these kinds of issues in translation in telling the story. And as I'm talking to them in this very casual conversation over dinner, where I think I'm just kind of getting them prepped to go do their work, their journalist work, right? One of them picks up a camera and starts taking my picture and asks me if they can use my picture in their stories. And it is this strange moment that I have where I'm an out of body experience. And I tell myself, wow, I am the object of this story now. Like I have this moment where I recognize that I have become the subject of the trauma. I am one of these people, right? And so I reference in the essay, in the slides, like that this essay, so you can read more about this experience. But what that did for me in that moment in 2017 was really remind me about the ethical impulse. No one asked me to have an interview with them. I wasn't having an interview. I was technically not on the record, and I've worked in journalism for a while as well. So I knew that I wasn't on the record, but all of a sudden I became part of, in days following a hurricane where I am really traumatized, right? Telling people all about the intellectual things they need to know and becoming part of the story. And I realized the ethics in that moment was about no one in that group have asked me how I'm doing, right? They haven't asked me if I need, they asked me if they could help me charge my phone, which I was grateful for, which everyone, because we didn't have electricity. But I bring this up to tell you that for me, it has completely added a different dimension to how I think about ethics in terms of the disaster. Most of the work that I've been asked to do and cover since then, my research area has certainly shifted to bring, as much as I used to be focused on my digital humanities work in bringing Caribbean studies and digital humanities to repatriate local knowledges, which is what I think about the work I do at Create Caribbean with students. That my focus has certainly shifted to make concerns about trauma more a primary part of that conversation, right? And to think about what silences and traumas come out of those practices. There were things that I did not want to talk about. There are things that happened that I did not want to address, putting me in a moment where I got to speak to someone, and using my sort of intellectual credentials to do that was a moment in which, like, I really had to consider for myself what work then I would do. How will I not replicate these problems, right? This is a question that happens in, although I've worked in journalism, journalism is not my practice. And so I recognize how us as scholars, a lot of the work we see documented in histories are coming, and I want to go back to the dLOC collections here. A lot of the work that we're talking about, this dLOC as data project, is framed around the Caribbean newspaper collection. A lot of the Caribbean newspapers are being digitized, and we think a lot about the work, the primary sources that we get to are done by people who are, there's a lot of content in the collections that we will be using to think about disaster coming from journalists or people working in a field where their job is to report on events, right? This is why Matt said, you will see a lot of documentation about numbers. Like, so people, when people are referenced, it's really in total in reference to harm done to bodies, not necessarily people and their humanity, right? Or you will see measures of property damage, GDP, percentage of GDP lost. A lot of reports that come out of hurricane, even today, even if you look at reports from 2017, a lot of the reports are focused on that. And then it takes people coming in from a perspective in analyzing that, interpreting that information that has been reported in newspapers, and then going and doing additional work. So if we think about, now we have access to daily newspapers that do this work. Dominica received quite a bit of attention in the days and in the weeks and months following the hurricane, and was covered in probably every newspaper. And then Dominica launched a Rediscover Dominica campaign maybe 6 months later to get tourists to come back, because, you know, that's what we need to do every time there's a disaster, is to remind tourists that we're still available for consumption. And we see this happening now with COVID as well, right? There's a big debate around that. But what happens when we have an operating, the media and the reporting and the sort of statistical way in which information is handled about disaster, the primacy of aid organizations and government and policymakers controlling the narrative that is put out in the media. So a lot of the documentation that we see are government reports, NGO reports, like you were saying, occupational forces reports, right? How then do we account for the silences? What is not reported in the news? I want to come out of this so I can show you two newspapers for us to think about silences, because we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we won't find unless we see something is like my example last week, you know, that we accidentally happen upon that tells us something we need to know. We might consider that some of those silences are intentional, that people maybe did not want to speak to reporters, like in my case. But we also want to consider this part that I think is important from my example and from other ways that we see these collections being used. Every documentation of disaster is a portal for reliving trauma. And I say this as someone who is experiencing this every time I have to give a talk or do work on, I think the work is important, and that I will get to this point about storytelling and narrative and responsibility. But every time you have to engage with disaster, it's a portal for reliving the trauma. So even if we see silences in the record, and some of those silences are intentional and, like I said, nefarious, sometimes the recuperating those silences is not necessarily in forcing the survivors to speak, or in engaging a dialogue or intentional generating of story from survivors, because that in itself is a form of harm, right? So part of the work of disaster studies and Caribbean studies in general, when we're thinking, because I don't think Caribbean studies can ever be thought of again broadly as an area, a field outside of disaster. I didn't think that we could ever, but now I'm pretty certain going forward that it is always framed in this context of both kind of ecological, cultural conversations around disaster, right? But what work can it do for the people who experience disaster? How are we writing, publishing monographs, publishing DH collections? How is our retelling of these stories useful, beneficial, or providing any type of healing or reparative, restorative work to the people who have experienced those traumas? This is a really real question. And sometimes the answer is that it is not. Sometimes the answer is, it is the audience is for the people who are continuing to create the conditions under which people experience harm severely, right? We're trying to mitigate the harm by bringing attention to stories or bringing attention to conditions in which people work, and that's fine. But also, how is the work that we're doing forcing, by going in and saying, my goal here is for you to tell your story so that we can convince policymakers to do better. This is a big ask of people, and I'm working on a project right now called Surviving Storms, which is a cartography project around the survival of Hurricane Maria. And when we were thinking about our ethical statement, this is a question we took very seriously. And we understood that sometimes people will say no. A lot of researchers have come to Dominica since the hurricane and asked people a lot of questions and asked them to give a lot of reliving of trauma. To what end? The primary thing that they see coming out of it is, oh, well, we want to bring the tourists back and we want to make sure that we have the resilient buildings. But a resilient building sometimes looks like moving someone out of their home space, as in the case of the community that was lost to Tropical Storm Erica. People were used to living in a farming environment with individual homes, with backyards and gardens and all of those kinds of things, and were relocated to a new community where they now live in essentially apartment buildings. That changes their entire frame of their lived experience, right? And a lot of research that went into production or the decision to relocate them did not consider something that there was a silence in the research, that they didn't consider how are these people going to acclimate to no longer living in a house with a yard with green space. And this is sort of a very important question in a country like Dominica, where connection to the land is such an important thing. So I'm looking at it from a position of policy research as well, not just for those of us who are doing historical work and archives, but policy research relying on what is reported as the source of the data that they use. Let me just stop sharing. I want to go to the, let's see. I just want to show you two things for a second.